Let's see what David Pakman has to say about burning it down versus fixing it, revolution versus reform. David Pakman tends to edge towards the center of left, although, unlike Tim Pool, I do think he has some progressive ideals and goals. His take on Bolivia was dog shit, though.
One of the biggest sort of philosophical or ideological battles that's happening right now within the left, and even to some degree within the progressive left, is about the approach to making change. How do you get change to
Boy, the quarantine's really gotten to him. I don't think I've ever seen his beard this scruffy.
happen? And we can sort of roughly, coarsely sum up the two positions by saying fix the system or burn the system down and create a new one once you've burnt
I don't promote political violence on this channel, but
down the system that we have. Now, it's an oversimplification. It's how we are oversimplifying today in order to have this discussion. There's more nuance to it than that, but in a large sense, this is it.
I do appreciate him mentioning that it is much more nuanced positioning than that, but it is true that, but for general discussions, it's okay to kind of essentialize like that.
Do you believe the system works well enough that you would try to make changes to it? Or do you believe that the system is so broken that it has to first fail or be destroyed before real change can be made? Now, from day one, when we talked about
I suppose I should give my opinion on this. When it comes to revolution versus reform, I think there are reforms that can be made that can improve our society somewhat, but I think the real fundamental structural changes that would be necessary to truly fix the inequalities in our world will require revolution. Not necessarily total systemic collapse, but something akin to what happened in the Soviet Union, where the ostensible socialists took control of the existing government structure. Now, obviously, I would hope that if we did have a situation like that, we would learn from the mistakes of Lenin and Stalin and rapidly dismantle the unnecessary parts of the government. But again, that is why I think that it'll probably be a revolution where it'll have to collapse, because if we just take over the existing infrastructure, we would have to work very hard, much harder than I think most people want to work, frankly, to change it, to actually change the system and not just put a red coat of paint on the United States.
for example, about two candidates, neither of whom ended up being the Democratic nominee, Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders. We talked about how on policy, they end up in pretty similar places on a lot of issues, but their approaches are very different. Bernie came from the 70s hippie, further left revolution mentality and was kind of pulled towards moderation in terms of a lot of his policy over time. Warren came from the opposite place. Warren came from a much more centrist or even center right position and eventually was pulled to the left, where her policies ended up being similar to Bernie in many ways. But she is in the mindset of fix the system, work within the system, make change.
Yeah, Bernie's position was, it was my end goal. What is your insulting counteroffer to my proposal? And then you go back and forth until you reach a compromise you can both vote on, which is hopefully a little less than you want, but more than they wanted to give you. Whereas Warren's strategy was, okay, so here's where I want to end up in 5 to 10 years. So for the first year or two, we're going to have this expansion of the ACA. And then a year after that, we'll expand it out to, we'll actually start expanding Medicare. She started off with a weak, watered down, milquetoast version of what she wanted, with the assumption she could incrementalize herself beyond that, which I don't think that's the best way. I feel like bold action and bold proposals are how you make significant changes. Again, if you're trying to get 3 free pizzas, you start out demanding 10 free pizzas, 2 orders of cheese sticks, and a large soda. Because then when you ask for the three large pizzas, it sounds much more reasonable than when you were asking for, $300 worth of pizza.
Changes to the system. Today, I want to talk only about what has worked in the history of the United States. So this is not an analysis of any candidate. This is not a moral judgment about any candidate. This is not an analysis of any particular policy that we're looking at. It is only historically which approach has worked for achieving change that move the country to the left, working within the system, or burn it down, build it back up, more of a revolutionary style approach.
Okay, already I kind of object to his framing here because obviously, speaking purely about the United States, unless you really, really, really broadly define revolution, the only thing that has worked in our history since 1776 is reform. I mean, as far as succeeded, I guess we can call the Civil War an attempt at revolution, but it failed. So, on the face of it, I object to his framing, but let's see what else he has to say.
We can call it whatever you want. None of these are pejoratives. I think we sort of understand what we're talking about here. And it certainly links more to the ideology, more of the Bernie Sanders supporter in the context of the Democratic primary. Now, as I've said before, the paradigm that has brought us the most progressive change in history is making changes to the system that we have rather than revolution and burning it down. Now, that being said, there have been times when the type of burn it down change that some want has happened, but I am going to make the case today that those big revolutionary moments have come after horrible events, what I would call cataclysm, that includes endless death. And we'll get to that in a little bit. So let's start by looking at the successes. There are three major eras of progressive leftward advancement in the United States that we can look at. We can look at the progressive era of the 1890s to the 1920s. We can look at the New Deal era between 1933 and 1939, and exactly how you define these eras, there's some leeway. And then the civil rights era of the mid-1950s to roughly 1965. So let's look at each of these and see which category they fall into. The progressive era at the turn of the 20th century was catalyzed by activism and demand for social reform. Going through every achievement of the progressive era would be sort of difficult, impractical, but the reforms of the progressive era dealt with corruption, dealt with labor and labor rights, dealt with antitrust, with women.
This is one reason why I don't really like the progressive label, because progressive is inherently a relative term. There's never any kind of, if you are progressive, that means you want to progress, which means that you want to change things from what they currently are, ostensibly for the better. So when we talk about the progressive era, it sounds like, that's where Bernie Sanders is from. And it's like, yeah, there were a lot of leftist sympathies and ideas in the early 20th century. Teddy Roosevelt here, the immortal God King Emperor of America, was infamous for his trust busting, for breaking up big corporations and companies and making it easier for smaller companies to compete with them. But I don't know that he particularly had any great care for workers' rights. He had a great care for environmental rights. Again, that's another great thing to his credit, is his love of the environment. Mostly so he could go shoot animals for sport in them. But, again, I'll as long as you legitimately share the same end goals as I do, I can probably stomach your reasons until we can achieve our goals. And then we can discuss what to do after that. But he also did terrible things to Panama. We can't deny that. He did awful things to Panama. And his speak softly but carry a big stick was a lot of 20th century American diplomacy. That was basically our entire strategy with the Soviet Union, was try to speak quietly and calmly and softly, but remind them that we have nuclear weapons aimed at all of their major population centers.
women's voting, of course, expanding labor policy and labor unions, a whole bunch of bureaucratic stuff that was really important, including things like municipal reform. And it was all catalyzed by the idea of we've got to build up the middle class, and economically that will be good. Morally, it's the right thing to do. And we've got to put in some safety net elements for the poor. It all happened by tweaking the system. Now, the thing is, progress can seem slow when you're in it. And in fact, this was a 30-year period. That's a long time. Now, from 2020, it's easy to look back and say, wow, look at all that stuff that they accomplished so quickly. But 30 years is a long time. And I encourage you to look at the full list of accomplishments. When you're in the middle of big change, 30 years seems very, very slow. Looking back, though, we realize, even though it was done by community activism, by slowly getting a more favorable Supreme Court, it led to major change. Now, let me give you an example of that. A lot of the progressive era reforms were upheld at the Supreme Court because of Justice Charles Evan Hughes joining with Oliver Wendell Holmes. Okay? Herbert Hoover nominated Charles Evan Hughes. Teddy Roosevelt nominated Oliver Wendell Holmes. So when we say, would Trump or Biden select a better replacement for Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and would it matter? Just look at how much this stuff matters. Look at who got to pick Supreme Court justices that led to progressive era reforms. And it was all tweaks, tweaks, tweaks. And over 30 years, it transformed the country. That's example number one. Let's look at example number two of fix the system rather than tear it down. The New Deal era of the 1930s under Franklin Delano Roosevelt. This came out of the Great Depression. It included changes that now are considered to be part of the fabric of the country, like the Social Security Administration, but they were not burn it down revolution type changes. It was regulate the banking industry by putting the right regulators in place, create programs to support farmers and the unemployed, support young people and elderly folks. Creating Social Security, you don't get that by burning down the system. They got it by taking more control of the system. Regulating securities trading, the Housing Act of 1937, building labor power on top of the changes of the progressive era. It wasn't burn it down. It was not revolution. It was 6 to 7 years of changes from a center-left president. Now, I'll go even further. This is important when it comes to the New Deal era. The New Deal era was so much not a revolutionary phase that there were people at the time saying FDR is not even center left. He's a centrist, and the New Deal is merely a smokescreen to reinforce capitalism as a system. That's how much not of a revolution the New Deal was.
I mean, that was Roosevelt's own rhetoric about it, at least in private. And given that, when was the business plot? 1933. Yeah, just when Roosevelt. Yeah, that's what I thought. There was a plot by wealthy businessmen to overthrow Franklin Roosevelt to create a fascist government, an explicitly fascist government in America. So Franklin Roosevelt had to raise the growing socialist movement in America against an actual attempt to overthrow his government by fascists, and chose to reinforce the status quo to try to prevent. And I'm not saying he was some oracle who knew that if he had capitulated more to the left, that we would have had a fascist government or something ridiculous like that. What I'm saying is that by reinforcing capitalism and creating greater workers' rights, he pacified the country. Whether that was a good thing or not, we all have to decide for ourselves. But to characterize it as anything other than a pacification of the country, I think is dishonest, at least.
Although, of course, I don't buy into that cynical interpretation. And important change happened over a 7-year period. Third, the Civil Rights era. The Civil Rights era was filled with protests and sitting.
It's also worth noting that Roosevelt served like 4 terms, so he had like 16 years in office to effect his change. That's a long time to shape both your proposals and shape the country to be amenable to those proposals.
Sit-ins and rallies, and a ton of the day-to-day elements that we often today recognize would likely be needed in order to achieve more change and achieve it more quickly. But look at the process. 1954, you got the Brown v. Board of Education decision. That was an early moment in the civil rights era, and it was a decision made, again, by the Supreme Court, reinforcing the importance of who gets to pick those justices. That continues to be a theme here. 1956, the NAACP works within the judiciary to win desegregation of the bus system. 1957, Martin Luther King creates the SCLC to support local protest movements and achieve change.
What I'm guessing he's going to ignore is the fact that Martin Luther King Jr. was a socialist who was trying to build socialist consciousness among people, and he started with black and brown people because they were the most harmed by capitalism to try to... I'm not saying he was trying to foment an actual socialist revolution, but he used a lot of similar rhetoric and a lot of the same arguments to appeal to disenfranchised people. So a lot of these are kind of reforms inspired by revolution, by revolutionary fervor and rhetoric and energy, which is, again, why I think that there's a lot that can be done within the sphere of reformation, but I think true structural change will take a revolution.
At the local level. In North Carolina, we had the drugstore sit-in 1960, which sparked a bigger era of sit-ins to continue making small changes legally in the judiciary at the local, state, and national level. In 63, you get the March on Washington. It demands jobs. It's a new fight against discrimination, which was demanding change from the government, not trying to take it down and cause a revolution. Ultimately, this led to the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Now, was that the end? Was that the be-all, end-all of fighting against racial discrimination? No, we're still in that process today. But the point is, the great eras of progress were not burn-it-down moments. Last thing I want to mention here, when there have been these bigger burn-it-down type moments of radical, fast change, they've typically been very bloody and came out of cataclysm. Example, the Civil War. Civil War went from 1861 to 1865. If in 1855, right, about 5 years before the Civil War, you had said, you know, in 6 years, the country will almost be torn apart over the issue of slavery. A multi-year war will ensue during which more than 600,000 people will die. We will just barely be held together, but big change will come of it. We all, of course, would welcome the end result, which is slavery is no longer allowed. But when you look at when things move more quickly in the more revolutionary way, there is endless death and destruction. And to think about causing it deliberately is questionable. And it took, you know, when you look at Reconstruction 12.
Okay, so this is something I see a lot of liberals say about revolution. Why would you want to... I actually had a brief argument with my sister about this on Facebook just last night. A friend posted a guide for rioting, and it was things like hit the chains and hit the big corporations, don't hit mom and pop organizations, don't hit bodegas, have a good place to fall back to, stay hydrated, stay healthy, wear your mask and gloves at all times in public. You know, some actual real good advice if you're ever involved in a riot. And my sister asked, why this? Why does there have to be violence? And I responded with something like, I don't know, this just seems like a good advice post. I mean, I didn't want to back off fully and point out that it was like 90% a shit post. You know, I don't think there's actually going to be rioting anytime in the near future. But, you know, if there is, this is good advice to have passed around. And she responded with, when I told her, you know, it's just good advice to have and, you know, push around, she was like, well, I don't get it. Why is there going to be riots? Why does there have to be violence? To which I just responded, because asking nicely didn't work. And that's the thing. We've been asking nicely for 30 years for these changes, and they just aren't coming. So maybe violence will be the answer. I don't want it to be, because he's right. There's a lot of problems that can come with violence, with revolution. A lot of people are going to die. Anyway, back to him asking if revolutionaries really want to hurt all those people, when the reality is we don't want to hurt people, we just want to affect change, and unfortunately there are people who are going to oppose that, just like we would oppose change in the other direction.
12 years in the United States because of the Civil War, it achieved a great victory, no question about it. It also brought incredible cataclysm to the United States. And sometimes it is the only way. That's what's really important. And of course, the North, the Union fighting in the Civil War, of course they were on the right side. And of course the right outcome came from it. But what history tells us is that if we want to expand healthcare, increase social reforms, regulate industry, the victories have come not from the cataclysm of the type that the Civil War sort of checks a box under.
That's because the only time we've had actual revolutionary fervor for positive leftist progressive changes, it was pacified by a center-left president. Like, we were on the verge of a socialist revolution. I'm not saying we were on the verge of creating a workers' utopia in America in 1932. I'm saying we were on the verge of a socialist revolution. We don't know what would have happened if Roosevelt had been a little bit slower in getting the New Deal out, or if it hadn't been quite as robust, or any number of different ways it could have happened. What we know is that in the early 1930s, there was a strong push for socialist revolution. And then the New Deal happened, a bunch of people went back to work, and that fervor died because it seemed like capitalism had been fixed and people were eating again. We're seeing the collapse of capitalism a second time, and I guess fortunately for socialists, unfortunately for everyone else, we don't have a center-left Democrat in office who's willing to make changes to the financial sector, to the business sector, to keep the proles from rioting. So we'll see. I don't think we're looking down the barrel of another socialist revolution in the next few years, but I also didn't think we'd have a president who would completely dodge responsibility for 20,000 American deaths from a 100% preventable pandemic.
It's come from the reform of the progressive era, the New Deal era, the civil rights era, and the like. Tell me where I'm wrong. This is my perspective. I welcome other perspectives respectfully and with peace and love. I'm on Twitter at @Pakman. I want to hear from you. Quick break, back after this. If you love feeding your intellectual curiosity, but you're always struggling to find the time, check out one of my all-time favorite apps called Blinkist.
Oh, this is all just shilling for whoever paid for it. Cool. So yeah, that was very milquetoast, Dave. And I think it definitely ignored how much revolutionary fervor there was in the United States prior to the New Deal, and how the hippies' refusal to engage really killed any kind of revolution that could have come out of the civil rights movement. So yeah, I think we're going to have to burn it down, but there are reforms that could be made in the meantime. So get out, organize. Well, don't literally get out. Stay home until we beat this coronavirus. But there's plenty of ways to organize online, get with organizations, join the DSA, join the IWW. Let's make the reforms we can while we're building up to the revolution that is coming. Hey, thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed the show. If you liked it, like, share, subscribe, and leave a comment. Thank you. See you next time.